Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, and thank you so much again for your patience. This is The Spirited Spectrum, Characteristics and Common Misconceptions about Autism, and we have the honor of having a very special guest expert tonight. So allow me to introduce you all to Adriana Karka of the Toronto-based Geneva Centre for Autism. Adriana has been with the Geneva Centre since 2007, first as a provincial autism resource consultant, and currently as a training institute faculty. Not only is she fluent in English, French, and Lithuanian, but Adriana is also an accomplished music therapist and behavior specialist for individuals with autism spectrum disorder and other intellectual developmental disabilities. So Adriana, we are so honored to have you on this call. Your extensive background in the field of autism and, of course, your obvious level of commitment to causing awareness for this disorder is really phenomenal. We are really happy to get started with you, and I will allow you to take it away at this point.
Okay, thank you so much, Reagan. Thank you for the very warm welcome, and I wanted to let everyone know that it's a true pleasure to be online with everyone this evening talking about a very important topic, and also one that we all know, everybody out there, we all know somebody who has autism, or we've worked or lived with somebody with autism, and so it's all dear to us in some way or another. So as you know, this is part one, characteristics and common misconceptions about autism, and we will be offering a part two as well in a month's time. So let's get started. I'm going to move to the next slide. So characteristics and common misconceptions about autism is tonight's topic. So let's move to the next slide. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things that I'd like to talk about this evening while we're together. So we're going to look at key characteristics associated with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. We'll look at some common challenges and common strengths. And another thing as well is that many of us have heard myths, or we have certain misconceptions, or we might have heard of people in the community mentioning different things about autism. So let's clear up some of the myths and misconceptions related to autism. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the incidence and the ratio of ASD. So one of the big myths when it comes to autism is that it is rare. And that is definitely not the case. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, last year, 2012, the statistics now are that in the US and Canada, 1 in 88 individuals are estimated to have autism spectrum disorder. So definitely, those of you who are working in schools or working in daycare centers or out in the community, you will definitely meet a child or a student or an individual with autism. And so it's very important and very relevant that we spend this time together and talking about the characteristics. It occurs across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, and this incidence is just about 1 in 110 worldwide. So all throughout the world, autism is also quite prevalent. Another thing that's interesting about autism is that the statistics show that it's 4 to 5 times more likely to occur in males than females. And this is definitely something that, that has been researched, and definitely something that occurs in boys more than girls. And there's actually one thing that I want to add, which is that the profile of boys is very different than the profile of girls. So it's possible that fewer girls are receiving a diagnosis of autism because they just have a different presentation. It is sometimes said that it's easier to diagnose or easier to detect autism in boys. So that might account for this statistic. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And what we're very happy to see at Geneva Centre is we've been taking a good long look at the new diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. Back in May of this year, so May 2013, the new manual came out. So that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, number 5. And so all of this information regarding the diagnostic criteria is very new. And so as of, it's only been 3 months, so as of only 3 months ago, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the diagnostic criteria now looks. So as you can see, there are 2 main diagnostic areas. A is social communication, and B is restricted repetitive behavior, and that includes sensory differences as well. So in the area of social communication, let's talk about the characteristics. So you will see in our individuals with autism a lack of social emotional reciprocity. And so what does that mean? That means that some of our children will have reduced sharing of interests or reduced sharing of emotions or ability to read emotions. You might see that quite early in a child's life. And sometimes out on the schoolyard, especially in the preschool years, you might see some of our children having difficulty sharing with others. So it's pretty typical in our children who are typically developing that they will want to share their toys. I don't mean share as in your turn, my turn, because small children have a tough time with that in general, but they might want to show a toy that they've got, or they might want to go up and look at what somebody else is doing. And so some of our kids with autism, we will see a lack in this area. Another thing that we will see is some difficulty with initiation and responding to social interactions. So that could mean that you might see some of our youngsters hovering around a group during playtime, but not being able to easily enter the group. Sometimes in the schoolyard, you might see some of our youngsters walking around the periphery of the schoolyard and not really participating in group play. And another thing, too, is that some of our individuals with autism might be approached by others, but their response to interaction might be difficult. So that's what you might see in that area. Another thing that you might see in social communication is a difficulty in the area of nonverbal. So when it comes to eye contact, body language, gestures, facial expressions, what you'll see are difficulties in these areas, and this is both demonstrating and understanding. So let me give you an example for body language. Those of you who are teachers and parents definitely know the body language where if you're upset with a small child or want them to stop doing something, you will cross your arms, you'll tap your right foot, and demonstrate quite a stern facial expression. And most of our typically developing children will notice that, and they'll think, uh-oh, mom is upset, or uh-oh, the teacher wants me to stop doing this, I'm fooling around. Whereas our children with autism may not pick up on those signs. So body language, what's really important to note is that body language makes up for about 85% of all communication. So if you think of nonverbal cues, things like rolling the eyes, things like crossing the arms, things like walking away from somebody or turning away from somebody when you're no longer interested, all of those cues might not be as readily picked up on by individuals on the spectrum. So let's look at the second part now, which is restricted repetitive behavior, and that includes sensory differences. So when it comes to this area, what you might see are stereotyped motor movements. So you might see things like finger movements, or twirling hair, or picking at eyelashes. You might see hand flapping, different behaviors like that. And they're stereotyped, meaning we do see them quite often in many individuals on the spectrum. You might also see a stereotyped way of playing or manipulating objects. So you might have seen some of our young children who, instead of driving a car up and down a ramp, they might take the car and just turn the little wheels on the car over and over again. And it's usually quite repetitive, and it's usually something that we see in many of our children. You might also see or hear, actually, repetitive speech. So you might have some of our kids who will repeat phrases or words, we'll talk about that coming up in a couple slides, but who might say things over and over again. Another thing in this area is a real insistence on sameness. So when it comes to routines, everything has to be the same every day. Transitions are difficult. A lot of difficulty with change. A lot of difficulty with not being able to predict what's happening. So we need everything to stay the same. And what I'm saying here is I'm not talking about strategies for teaching. So this is just the characteristic of autism. So many of our individuals will actually hope and insist that things stay the same, but we can very, very calmly and slowly try to shape that behavior so that that individual does slowly learn to accept change. Another thing that you will see in this area of restricted repetitive behavior is highly restricted interests. And what that means is many of our children will have one interest or two interests that are very repetitive and restricted. They might become absolutely highly educated in one area. So you might have a 6-year-old child who knows everything about electricity, or you might have a 12-year-old who is so highly interested in trains that he or she has every bit of knowledge out there and actually speaks and understands and is able to lecture on trains and transportation in a university level. So that's definitely something that we see with many of our individuals on the spectrum. And also in this area, so you can see that it says include sensory, many of our individuals could display either an overreactivity or an underreactivity to sensory stimuli. So it could be things like covering your ears because you find it very noisy in a room, whereas the other individuals in the room are not reacting in that way. They don't find it as noisy. It could be something like touching a hot plate or touching a oven and not feeling that you've just burnt yourself because you're under responding. And so as you can see here in B, you must have 2 out of 4 characteristics. So not all of our individuals, not all of our children will have insistence on sameness or a over-responsiveness or under-responsiveness to sensory, whereas in the social communication section, you must have 3 out of 3 characteristics. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So just quickly, if you can see, if you click it one more time, the 2 green parts slide underneath the blue autism spectrum disorder rectangle there. And what that shows is that in DSM-4, so in the older diagnostic criteria, there used to be 2 specific entities. There was one called autistic disorder, then there was another one called Asperger's syndrome. And so you probably come across quite a lot of individuals, either in your schools or in your home or in your daycare centers, who might have one of those diagnoses. And those 2 diagnoses still exist, and you'll find that the family members and the people themselves actually still say that they have one of those disorders. But in order to capture all of the diagnostic information, those 2 have now been put under the larger category of autism spectrum disorder. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So autism is brain-based and neurological disorder. It is definitely not an emotional disturbance. It is not a behavior disorder in that you might hear that's a myth. You might hear that individuals with autism can't control their behavior or they have poor behavior or something like that. It's absolutely not so. It's definitely a disorder where there has been a very large body of research done where it's definitely based in the brain. And There have been studies done post-mortem, so autopsy studies, studying the actual brain itself and studying the structure of the cells and the shape and size of different parts of the brain. And there are very significant differences between the brain of a person with autism and the brain of a typically developing person. Also, there have been quite a few studies done through magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, on living individuals, and what they're finding is that when an individual is given a certain stimulus, so maybe a light shined in their eyes or shown a certain image, different parts of the brain will light up than a typically developing person. So that's very important to note as well, because this is definitely a brain-based disorder. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And needless to say, you'll find a lot of strengths in our individuals on the spectrum. For example, because the brain is different, you might see a true ability to attend to detail. And many of our individuals who receive education and a lot of coaching for their future might end up in very, very detail-oriented careers, things like computer science, engineering, mathematics, because they're able to spend very long periods of time focusing and attending to detail, and that touches on the second point there. Identifying patterns. A lot of times our individuals on the spectrum can see things that we can't. So it's just a different way of thinking, a different way of looking at things, but they're very strong in a visual way. Many of our individuals as well will have an enormous visual memory. If anybody has heard of Temple Grandin, Dr. Temple Grandin, she is a woman with autism. I'll just spell her name for you, Temple, and last name Grandin, Grandin. She's a professor of animal science, and she actually has a brain where everything plays like a recording, like a video recording in her mind. So every time she hears somebody speaking, she'll actually see images in her mind, and that's the way that she processes the information. So a lot of our individuals, I would say upwards around 80% will have a visual way of thinking. Okay, so let's talk about communication now. So let's move on to the next slide. And one of the myths that we've heard is he's nonverbal, so he can't understand what you say to him. And definitely this is a myth. I've worked with many individuals where we say verbal is not their first language. Maybe their image or visual abilities are very, very good, so they use pictures to communicate, etc. And what I found, and what many of us have found at Geneva Centre in working and spending time with individuals on the spectrum, is that even if you might not speak, your receptive language, so your ability to understand, might be really, really advanced. So let's move on to the next slide. As you know, in communication, there are two parts. So there's the ability to express yourself, expressing your wants, expressing your desires, etc. And there's the ability to take in information and understand it. So what we often find in communication when it comes to individuals on the spectrum is that you will find that some of our individuals on the spectrum might not have a strong ability to express themselves verbally, but they might have a very strong receptive sense. So they can understand everything, they can understand pictures, they can understand gestures, they can understand very specific, well-structured teaching strategies that you might use. And then you might have the flip side, which is some of our individuals who are very expressive, have really great verbal ability. So that used to be called Asperger syndrome, an Asperger profile in the DSM-4. And that is that many of our individuals who are able to speak very, very well may not, however, have a very strong receptive ability. So they might not be able to understand several step directions. They might need pictures, and they might need you to write things down in order for them to better understand what's going on, even though they speak very, very well. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So what you might see in the area of communication is an inconsistent method of communication. So you might see somebody who might not have verbal as their first language, but they might be able to communicate through pictures. However, not all environments might be using pictures or might not be using the same communication system in all areas. And so it's quite inconsistent. And in part 2, we'll talk a lot about the need to create consistent communication systems so that an individual with autism feels actually quite strong in their ability to communicate, because they'll be doing the same thing in all environments. You'll also see echolalia. So I'm just jumping ahead a little bit because I know that we're a little bit behind in time. Echolalia, actually you'll hear echolalia, because what that is, it's a verbal behavior where some of our individuals on the spectrum will repeat what you say. So you might say, "Hi, Johnny," and the child will repeat, "Hi, Johnny." That's called immediate echolalia. And then there's something called deferred echolalia, which means that an individual might pick up phrases from movies, might pick up something from the radio or television, and might repeat it over and over again. So for example, they might pick up a jingle from a commercial, and then they might come to school and sing, you know, "Have a break, have a Kit Kat, have a break, have a Kit Kat." They might be repeating those phrases from the commercial. Okay, another thing that many of our individuals on the spectrum might be dealing with is auditory processing difficulties. So in this area, some of the research is actually showing that some of our children with autism might not be able to process incoming auditory information as quickly as some of our typically developing children. So what that means is you might say something to an individual with autism, and instead of it taking 2, 3, 4 seconds for the information to be processed, it might take 10, 12, 15 seconds. And what do we usually do? In that time period, most of us will repeat the instruction again, or we might repeat it several times. We might say, "Johnny, go get your shoes on." "Okay, come on, Johnny, go get your shoes on." Go to the door and get your shoes on. And before you know it, what you've done is you've given that person a lot of instruction, and really what you could have done was just show that child a picture of shoes, or maybe pointed to the shoes or pointed to the door. So that's something that is present in many of our individuals on the spectrum. Literal thinking is another one. So think about all of the idiomatic speech we use. Things like, "Hey, what's up, doc?" Or, you know, saying, "Oh, you're pulling my leg." All the different idiomatic expressions that we're using. And a lot of our individuals on the spectrum, even those who are very, very cognitively gifted and really have wonderful abilities, might not pick up on idiomatic speech, and that information would need to be taught. So what does pulling your leg actually mean? What does "what's up, doc" really mean? You'd have to make sure that you take time to teach those expressions to our individuals on the spectrum. And then word retrieval, especially in times of stress, our children might not be able to come up with the words or come up with the phrase or come up with the answer as quickly as others. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So another myth is that people with autism would rather be by themselves. So let's talk about why this is a myth. Let's go on to the next one. Some of you might be familiar with the term theory of mind, and some of you may not. So Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen created this theory by noticing that many of the individuals with autism with whom he was working actually had a difficult time putting themselves in somebody else's shoes, so taking the perspective of somebody else. This is also sometimes called mind blindness. Let's move on to the next one. And what sometimes happens with theory of mind is that somebody with autism might have difficulty in one of these areas. So they might not understand or pick up on the listener's level of interest. And this could be some of our kids with autism who are very, very interested in one particular topic, might approach a peer in the classroom and just talk and talk and talk about their favorite interest and not realize that the other peer is sort of bored, looking away, not interested, thinking about, you know, some of our kids who are very interested in Pokemon cards, for example, might go up to someone who doesn't really have an interest in Pokemon cards and just talk and talk about each card and each power and each character, and after a while not realize that they're not making a connection with that other peer. Not always picking up on a speaker's intended meaning. So sometimes what happens is you might have some of our kids with autism be vulnerable to bullying or vulnerable to being made fun of because they're not picking up on manipulation, they're not picking up on sarcasm, they're not picking up on what the other person might be intending and what they're saying. And then there's something that is called the hidden curriculum. I really encourage you to look that up, maybe in a search engine, and get more information about it, especially those of you who are educators. This really speaks to some of the difficulties that our kids on the spectrum are having. And these are the unwritten social rules. So we all have so many moments in our lives where we just pick up on what's going on in the social situation. So for example, let's say all of us today were in a classroom setting, we're all together live, and we would pick up right away that certain people have staked out or chosen their seats, and they've put their bag there, they've put their coffee there. And so if somebody else went and sat in that person's seat, that would be a social faux pas. And the hidden curriculum actually states that if somebody has saved the seat with a coffee or a bag, you do not sit in somebody else's seat. But if you're not picking up on that social rule, you might go sit in that person's seat, and then everybody around you will think, what's wrong with that person? So that's that area. And then not always being able to anticipate what others think of one's actions. So not always being able to pick up that somebody might not appreciate the behavior that you're currently engaging in, or somebody might not be understanding what you're doing. So not being able to read somebody else's, thoughts, basically. Okay, let's move on. So I do see that we're actually already at 9:25. So I'm going to move a little bit faster. In this area of shared attention, initiating and maintaining reciprocal interactions, and waiting and turn-taking, I just wanted to highlight one thing, and that's the shared attention. So at a very, very early age, so at around 18 months, shared attention is very, very very much seen in our typically developing young children. They really want to show you things when they are playing with something and they find it particularly interesting. They will search in the room, does somebody else see this? They might even look up and try to capture the eyes of the caregiver or of another child, and this is not usually so in autism. So that's actually something that can be tested for in early childhood, even in infancy, shared attention, or it's also called joint attention. So you might want to look that up as well for your own interest and your own education, joint attention or shared attention. Okay, so sensory processing. So this is a very prevalent myth. We've heard this one quite often, and that's that she does that self-stimulatory behavior for absolutely no reason. She just does that behavior. And let's talk about some of the reasons why that really is not so. So moving on to the next slide, there's something called sensory modulation. And if you take a look at the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see something called optimal arousal. And what that means is all of us, everybody neurologically, is always trying to get to the spot of optimal arousal. So that's why we put the elevator door there. Everybody wants to get out on that one, in that one place. And what that means is that we're always neurologically trying to regulate our bodies and regulate our neurology in order to feel alert, in order to feel ready to work or ready to engage in whatever situation we're in. We're always, we could even be doing things like sometimes, doodling when we're in a classroom, or tapping our foot, or shifting around in our seat, or getting up and walking around. We're always trying to maintain that level of optimal arousal. And when it comes to individuals on the spectrum, there are two other floors, let's say, and you see the people going up and down the elevator. There are those who are very over-responsive, and so we also call that sensory defensive. And we might be seeing our individuals who are avoiding sensory information because it just is coming in too quickly and they're over-responding to it. So again, I had mentioned earlier things like covering the ears because it's too noisy in the room, things like maybe gagging or feeling sick around the lunch table or smelling other people's foods, all those kinds of things, sensory defensive. You also probably have heard of the term tactile defensive, which are individuals who might really not enjoy touching different textures. They find certain textures they respond way too much to, and they over-respond and find it very uncomfortable. And then on the other side of this elevator, let's say, you have the individuals who are under-responsive. And so they're always trying to get up to the area of optimal arousal by seeking more information. So you might have some of our individuals who might engage in some dangerous behaviors, actually, things like smelling chemicals or licking things that might be dangerous or might cause some illness. You might have individuals who are staring into bright lights or putting a lot of visual items right in front of their eyes and trying to get a lot of movement and a lot of stimulation, visual stimulation right in front of their eyes. These are the individuals, too, who might be touching everything, who might be pushing up against things and trying to get different feelings of pressure. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And so this can happen in all 5 senses. So obviously in the areas of vision, auditory, gustatory or taste, olfactory, the area of smell, tactile, touch. But there are 2 other sensory systems that you might not be thinking about, and those are equally as important, especially when you're looking at a profile of a child with autism spectrum disorder. And those are vestibular, and that really has to do with a person's balance and their ability to create a balance between themselves and gravity. And so these are some of the children who might feel ill in the car, so they might get car sick because of movement. These are some of the individuals who might not like to have their hair washed because they have to turn their head backwards in order to wash their hair, and they don't like that feeling of having their body get out of balance. These are some of the individuals who on the other end of the vestibular spectrum might enjoy roller coaster rides or might enjoy elevator rides or might enjoy swings because they love having their body moved quickly. And then the other area, the other sensory system, is called proprioception. And this has everything to do with your body having its muscles and joints react. So these are some of our kids who might have a very, very hard way of writing or of walking. They might really, really make a lot of noise when they walk because they're trying to activate the joints in their feet. Or they might be trying to activate the joints in their hands. So they might be writing with a lot of pressure and ripping the paper. And these are also the individuals who might be always seeking pressure. So they might be leaning up against you. They might be trying to squeeze between a bed and the wall. They might be trying to squeeze underneath the couch, always trying to activate and press on the muscles and the joints. Okay, let's keep going. So now let's talk about anxiety. And we'll move on to the next slide. And here, anxiety is present in a very, very high percentage of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. It's not actually written about in the DSM-5, but what we really talk about at Geneva Centre is you really have to take a look at the anxiety level of the person first before you can start a teaching strategy. Because if somebody is very highly anxious, that needs to be taken care of before anything else. So what is anxiety? It's the fear in the absence of real danger. And this is Catherine Manassis. She's a pediatrician at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto. And what that definition really shows us is that it might not be real danger for us. There might not be a big barking dog ready to pounce on you right there, but you might be afraid of it all the same. And so what happens is the stress reaction, so the physiological reaction, will be exactly the same. That individual will have heart palpitations. That individual might have a stomach ache. They might be sweating. They might be scared. And so the feeling is real for that individual. The person who is experiencing anxiety is actually feeling the same physical sensations as if that stimulus was right there in front of them. So that's really important for us to note too. And often we will, try to just rub the back of somebody with autism and say, there, everything will be fine. But what you really have to realize is that physiologically and neurologically, if that person is feeling anxiety, you really have to take care of the anxiety with specific strategies. We're not going to get into them this evening, but we will talk about anxiety in general. So let's move on to the next slide. So here, what we've done is we've got two anxiety-provoking situations, potentially anxiety-provoking situations. One is you're in the classroom and you've been asked to do show and tell. So you're presenting to your peers. So why could this be anxiety-provoking especially for a student with autism? There might be a number of reasons. So let's take a look at this environment. So this is a little girl. It's just a photograph that we picked from the web. So just a picture of a girl presenting on a science project, and she's got a number of kids looking at her, and she's in the front of the class. And so what might be happening if you have autism is you might get anxious about word retrieval. So you might, because you're anxious, not be able to get out what you want to say, and so you get more anxious. So you're having trouble expressing yourself. Another thing, too, is you might be having a sensory overload in the moment. So, there's lots and lots to look at. Everybody's staring at you. Everybody's got their science projects in front of them. It might be quite bright in the room. You might be feeling some anxiety around a lot of the visual stimulation in the room. Maybe there are a lot of things on the wall, and you can't focus simply on what you're supposed to do. There's also a high need of predictability that many of our kids on the spectrum are always trying to achieve. And here, what if something goes wrong? What if I forget what I'm trying to say? What if the kids ask questions that I don't know how to answer? And so the anxiety can really be fueled by those. Another thing, too, is that presenting to peers, there's a social expectation to get up there, be short and sweet, do what you need to do, answer your questions, and move on. And so sometimes not knowing what the expectations are, or maybe knowing them because you heard the teacher give you the expectations verbally, but you don't remember them. Maybe you need a visual representation of what the expectations of this activity are, and that might help with mitigating your anxiety a little bit. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So birthday party. So here, this is a happy occasion for many typically developing children. Many children love being invited to birthday parties. Many children have fun going to their friends' homes. Many children get excited by the birthday party event itself, all of the fun things that are going to happen at the party. But what if you are a kid with autism? What might happen from the point of view of stress and anxiety? So again, the number one thing here is the social expectation of a birthday party. So first of all, you're probably going over to somebody else's house. And at that somebody else's house, there is a completely different set of rules. Maybe where you put your shoes is not the same as where you put your shoes at home. Maybe where you hang your coat is not the same as where you hang your coat at home. Maybe what you do when you get to the house, maybe who you talk to, who you greet is not the same as at home. So the social expectations are different. And also when it comes to, socially what you're expected at that particular person's home. Another social expectation with birthday parties especially is that all the attention goes on the birthday girl or the birthday boy. You're not supposed to have all your attention put on you. And so that is very difficult, especially, you remember me talking about theory of mind. So suddenly I have to put myself in the shoes of the birthday girl or the birthday boy and realize that I am the guest and that I'm supposed to be happy for the birthday girl or birthday boy, and they're supposed to basically do everything first. So they get to open the gifts, and I have to sit and watch. But what if I like that Thomas the Train that this child just unwrapped? Why can't I touch it? Why can't I go and play with it? And then it's time for cake, and it's the birthday girl who is going to blow out the candles. It's the birthday girl who is going to cut the piece of cake. It's the birthday girl who's going to, probably with a parent, hand the cake over one at a time, and everybody has to wait their turn to take a piece of cake. And what if I don't like the cake? What if the taste of the cake is not particularly palatable for me? What am I going to do? So imagine all of this anxiety that can be fueled by something as simple as a birthday party. And again, I'm speaking to those of you out there who are parents of children with autism. It's definitely a wonderful thing to have your child go to birthday parties, to participate in social events with other children, but we definitely want to make sure that we teach our children with autism the social expectations of events such as these, and then maybe even ease it in slowly, meaning you might want to attend a part of a party, go home a little bit earlier, or attend the end of a party, or if there are parts of the party that might be particularly anxiety provoking, such as certain games or certain rituals at a party, you might want to avoid those or not take part in those, but take part in the whole party in itself as much as possible. Another thing you might see in here are the balloons, and many of our kids with autism, with their sensory sensitivities, might have a lot of anxiety around the popping of those balloons. So sometimes also ensuring that those of you knowing. So here in this area, you'll have signs of stress and anxiety. And what this means is, what can you see or hear happening in an individual with autism when they're stressed and when they feel anxious? Sometimes what will happen is you'll hear a lot of self-talk or repetitive talk. You might hear somebody asking questions over and over and over again. Is my battery okay? Do you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect. You might actually also see rigidity. So what that means is you might see an individual who will go back to their patterns of behavior that actually are trying to calm them down. Things like, if I always sit in the red chair in the classroom and that chair is not available to me right now, especially in a moment of anxiety, I'm going to get very upset, so I'm going to go try to get that red chair. Or if I always use the green marker and I can't find it right now, I might become very upset and rigid about the green marker, and so I'll go for the green marker. You might also see self-injurious behavior. It's called SIB for short, and this might be some of our individuals who will start pulling their hair or start hitting their head or start biting their lip. Might engage in picking their fingers, any of those behaviors that are injuring their body. Okay, let's move on. Cognitive processing. So I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide, which is called one-track mind. And just in case, I'm going to just switch phones, or I'll bring the other phone. So when it comes to one-track mind, there's a doctor named Dr. Tony Atwood, and he is from Australia, and he actually wrote the book, The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome. And so this quote that you see in front of you is from him, and what he's saying is that individuals on the spectrum, because of the characteristics of autism, are very, very specific to the way that they view their routine. So they're almost like a train that will have a lot of trouble if they derail. Whereas typically developing individuals are able to change direction, any way they'd like. And so it's like going off-road. Let's go on to the next one. So some of the cognitive processing challenges that you might see in our individuals with autism are things like difficulties planning and organizing, difficulties organizing their routine or organizing their day. A lot of our individuals who are adults might do fabulously at work, but they need someone to help them with the everyday, getting themselves organized, making sure that the tasks are completed, making sure that they've got their calendar all set up. And so what we often say at Geneva Centre is it's almost like you need an executive assistant. So everything else, the academic stuff, the abilities in your work environment, the abilities in school might be really doing quite well. But you might have a really hard time with organizing your everyday. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Oh, so we're almost done. So just remember that every person on the autism spectrum will be different. If you've met one person with autism, you've only met one person with autism. Their interests will be different. Their strengths and challenges will be very different. Every single person with autism is unique. So what you've learned this evening may not be exactly the same in every child with autism you come across. Okay, let's look at the next slide. So just a couple things from Geneva Centre. So if you want to learn more about autism, let's move on to the next slide. We have a number of courses and events at Geneva Centre that will give you a much more thorough body of knowledge. So we have something called the Autism Intervenor Certificate courses, and these are 15-hour courses. They're usually in class, but we do travel to different parts of the province and beyond. And that you've heard, every single area of autism will be taught in great detail. And there's a course, assignment, and all the rest of it, and you get a certificate. Let's move on to the next one. And we're very, very excited that we've just launched several months ago an online applied behavior analysis certificate course. So it's completely online. It's video-based learning. You have quizzes and you have live chats and some really, really exciting parts of this course. And then at the end, you get an ABA certificate from the Geneva Centre for Autism. So we are very, very excited that we have launched this, and it's doing really well. And we hope that you can look at this one as well. Let's move on to the next one. Another thing that we just put online not too long ago is a free series specifically made for educators, and it's Introduction to Autism. There are 12 e-learning modules, and anybody, so please tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell other teachers, anybody out there are able to quickly get onto our website. So you go to www.autism.net, and you can download these 12 modules so you get a lot more in-depth information. And let's move on to the next one. So just for us to kind of let you know that we're always accepting registrations for them, and you just go to our website, or you can go to our other site within a site called elearning.autism.net. And a number of years ago, we created this website, and there is so much free information on there, so many things that you can download, visuals, strategies to look at, all kinds of things. So I really recommend and encourage you to go to these two sites. And that's it.
All right.
So thank you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Adriana. Thank you for those awesome resources as well, and all of the insightful facts that you covered. I know everybody is still just soaking everything up right now. And thank you so much to the audience for hanging on right until the very end here. So I'm going to open the call up for questions now. So everybody that can carry on over to their question box. If you have anything that you'd like to ask Adriana before we wrap up, I can pass that on over to her.
Okay, and you'll be reading those to me, Reagan?
I will. Yep. I'm just waiting for a couple to come in here. And I'll just let everybody know as well, because I know many have inquired about this presentation in particular. On Tuesday, August 6th, it will be available in a blog format at community.scholarschoice.ca on our blog page, so everybody can get this full video. It's going to include the presentation and the whole talk. So we'll start here with a couple questions. Adriana, we have one, kind of one of the very basic ones is at what age do you feel it's appropriate to really diagnose autism in a child?
Okay, so I can't really speak to a specific age because we do have a lot of individuals on the spectrum who are diagnosed anywhere from early childhood through to adulthood. But usually what happens is that around the age of 18 months to 2 years, there might be a diagnostic check or a red flags check done by either the family doctor or even a developmental pediatrician, and so some of our children with autism can receive a diagnosis at around age 3 or 4 years old, or even earlier. And some of our siblings, meaning some of our children who have an older sibling who already has a diagnosis of autism, might get a diagnosis even earlier, around age 2. So that's always helpful too, especially when it comes to getting the interventions that a child might need to get the diagnosis as early as possible.
Absolutely. And actually, to attach to that question, what is the role actually of an autism intervener then? Do they play a part in the
Ah,
general diagnosis?
okay, so no. So autism intervener is a term that we created loosely when we wrote this course, meaning that it's not a professional term, so it's not that you become an autism intervener. So I'm sorry for anyone who is looking at that and assuming that that's a professional title. The autism intervener is somebody who basically intervenes in a person's life. So either support somebody in school, you can be a teacher, you can be a support staff, you can be a principal, you can be a psychologist, you can be anyone. Basically, you're intervening in the life of a person with autism. You can even be a parent, you can be anyone. And what we're trying to do by having somebody go through this course is that by the end, you learned enough strategies and interventions and supports that you actually feel comfortable and you feel empowered to intervene correctly and supportively in the life of a person with autism.
Oh, okay. Perfect. So moving on to the next one then. Actually, in regards to this presentation, we had somebody ask the criteria that you presented. Is that public information that can be accessed, or is that just private for doctors and autistic therapists?
So the information is actually published in the manual. And the manual is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, number 5, can be accessed at the library. So yes.
Perfect. All right. We actually had somebody looking as well for the book that you mentioned, the curriculum,
The hidden
the,
curriculum.
the
Oh,
hidden
the
curriculum.
author of that one is Dr. Brenda Smith Miles.
Perfect. All right. So get that one. Um, Now, somebody asks, in regards to the idiomatic speech that you mentioned in the beginning, if,
Sure.
if an autistic child does not understand or doesn't understand the idiomatic speech, would they not be able to then understand any sarcasm or jokes at all?
It's possible. It's possible that some of our students with autism who struggle with the literal thinking or the difficulty with idiomatic speech, they might find it difficult to understand jokes and understand sarcasm because maybe they haven't been taught what that means. And when it comes to jokes, we actually spend a lot of time with our kids with autism actually practicing jokes. You can start by doing things like easy riddles or knock knock jokes, and then slowly building up to the more abstract jokes. So again, it's very much true that they might not understand easily jokes and sarcasm, but that doesn't mean that we can't take steps to teach these skills so that the person is able to engage socially.
Right. Okay. Now, this is a great question. We have once there is a diagnosis of autism, once parents or teachers have been made aware of it, do you find there is a certain time, a certain age where the child should actually be told about their diagnosis, where they should be made to really understand it?
So this is definitely a personal decision in every family. You know, we find that every family decides when is the right time, because everybody's different. Their ability to understand or take in this kind of information might be earlier or it might be later in life. Sometimes we're finding that we get families asking us, should I tell my child that he or she has autism? And they might be a teenager, or they might be in the early sort of 9, 10, 11, 12 years old age frame. And so it really depends on the child. One thing that you can do to get started, if you are wanting to tell your child about their diagnosis, is to research and look at books for children or books for adolescents about autism, or about just differences in general, or stories about children who have different ways of thinking. There are several books on autism heroes, so people who might have autism or people who historically might have presented like somebody with the characteristics of autism, but they might have really achieved a lot of things in their life. Maybe show videos about individuals who've done really well, and just slowly start that process. But it's definitely something that we always make sure is a personal decision on the part of the family.
Absolutely. Oh, okay. A great question. I know so many people are probably thinking this on the line, so many teachers are. What would be your best basic advice that you would give to a new teacher that knows that they'll be having a student in their class with autism?
What's the number one piece of advice? Well, I would say before anything else, when you meet that student, get to know them, get to know what their interests are, get to know what their likes and dislikes are. You might even make a little chart for yourself that could be columns, and in those columns you can make notes on things like this student really likes the following, this student can't stand the following, this student is calmed by the following, this student does not like or doesn't enjoy the following, and sort of make it by a gradient, and get to know that student and get to know how that student is motivated. That's really, really important. So when you first meet them, you might notice that that particular student might not be motivated in the same way that the other students in the classroom are. So they might not tend or respond to praise as much, or they might not find simple things like a good grade on a paper, or being able to have their drawing up on the wall as motivating as a toy or a video game or something specific that they really, really like. So talk to the parents, find out as much as you can about that student when you first meet them, and just spend time getting to know them. There's also something called pairing, which means spend time creating a relationship with that student. So it might be, that they really, really like, I'm coming back to Pokemon cards. They might really like Pokemon cards, so you might want to talk to them about Pokemon, or you might want to bring them some Pokemon cards. I mean, this is a little bit controversial because I know some teachers really don't want Pokemon cards in their classroom. But get to know them, find out what they like.
Right, all about really finding the connection there, eh?
Absolutely.
So actually, this is a question we're having quite a bit come up as well, is that many people, even new mothers, are wondering if autism has been traced yet to something that is hereditary, biological, or something that just comes with time. Is there any solid proof yet that that could be something that runs in a family?
So I definitely would direct you to some of the research that's out there. So if you go, for example, to some of the research coming out of McMaster University, they're looking at some genetic susceptibility. We're also looking at sibling studies. So you can go into a search engine online and type in things like sibling studies with autism, or family genetic links of autism. And there's definitely, in some families, there's definitely a link. but not in all families. So it really is not something that is occurring in every family. So definitely take a look at it. Definitely spend a bit more time researching it. And then you were also mentioning biological. So that's another thing as well. You might want to look at some of the information that's coming out of, for example, Dr. Martha Herbert. She studies biological causes, possible biological causes of autism. So you might want to look at some of that research as well. I would definitely research it. I would look at it. And just to answer that in all is that we are not seeing that in every family or in every child with autism.
Okay, great. It's so obvious how diverse your knowledge is on this topic, Adriana, and I'm sure the whole audience really wishes that we could pick your brain for much longer. But we are going to wrap up right now, and everybody in the audience that has posed a question, we will pass it on to Adriana and her team at the Geneva Centre so that those will not
Perfect.
get answered. And to remind everybody as well again, there will be on August 27th, a Tuesday night as well, part 2, where Adriana's colleague will be leading this talk for the second half. So that we'll be covering much more information, and we will have time to address more of these questions. We will just move along and thank you so much, Adriana, for being on the call.
Thank you.
And to the whole Geneva Centre for Autism, really for this, for their support of this event and allowing us to borrow you for the evening.
It was my pleasure.
So if everybody on the call is interested in learning more on this topic or the resources that the Geneva Centre has to offer, there is the original sites that were listed by Adriana in her presentation. They can be contacted as well at traininginstitute@autism.net or visiting their main site, www.autism.net. And if you found this webinar extremely valuable, just feel free to visit community.scholarschoice.ca for more educational articles, and it is also where this presentation will be available on Tuesday, August 6th in our blog format. So you can also join our Facebook community that is over 7,000 members at facebook.com/scholarschoice.ca. And when we're releasing new great content, that's usually where we inform people on our Facebook page first. So please join us there. And if you have any feedback about this webinar, we'd love to hear that via Facebook or within the follow-up survey that you'll receive through email after tonight. So we really hope that you've all gained some perspective and real power to address this disorder. And on behalf of Scholars Choice, thank you so much for joining tonight. We hope to see very many of you at Teacher Appreciation Day tomorrow. So you can actually log on to our Facebook page as well to find out what time your local store opens. And hopefully the winners of the gift cards can go and spend those tomorrow. So thank you so much, everyone. And Adriana, have a great night.